Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Just one more day until Australia votes and the polls are narrowing. Labor is still in front, but there's a very real chance of a hung parliament. We've also seen Scott Morrison come from behind before, back in 2019. It feels like it's been a long campaign, 6 weeks of daily press conferences, plenty of personal attacks, and perhaps a bit less policy than we've seen in the past. Anthony Albanese's had his share of stumbles and even spent a week in isolation with COVID. For his part, Scott Morrison declared a week ago that the bulldozer was gone, then accidentally flattened a child while playing soccer. Anyway, the campaign's been underway. The big issues kept coming. China made a security deal with the Solomon Islands. The Reserve Bank increased rates for the first time in more than a decade, and the cost of living crisis continued. Michael Pachi is the National Political Editor for Nine Radio and my guest this morning. Michael, welcome to Fear and Greed.
No problems. Thank you for having me, Sean.
Up front, what do you think will happen tomorrow? Do you think we'll have a clear winner tomorrow night?
Look, I don't think that we'll have a clear winner on Saturday. I do think that it would probably be a minority or hung parliament. I've been thinking this for quite some time. I know that the polls seem to suggest that Labor will be able to form government, but the fact is the polls have now been tightening, the published polls that is, they've been tightening over the last week and a bit. So this 8 to 10 point gap that Labor had, let's say, a month or a little bit more than a month ago is narrowed to about 1 or 2. The thing that we've got to keep in mind here, Sean, is that the primary vote for both the Liberal Party or the LNP in Queensland and the Labor Party is very low. It's, hovers in the low to mid 30s. And I don't think that that's enough for either side to be able to form a government in their own right. They probably will be relying on independents and some of these minor parties to get over the line. So I think that that's one thing that's been consistent with the polls is that the primary vote for both the major parties has been fairly low. They haven't really been able to get into the 40s fairly often. And people do say, the analysts do say, that you need to get into that 40 mark, the 40% mark for your primary vote to be able to govern in your own right. And neither side has really been able to do that. They've been stubborn with that primary vote in the early 30s. And for that reason, I do think that we are probably still looking at a hung parliament or minority government. I just can't see where Labor picks up another 7 seats. Remember, Labor's got 69 now. It's got to keep those 69 and win another 7 to be able to govern in its own right. The government, the coalition's got 75. It needs to keep those 75 and probably win another 2 more to be able also to govern in its own right comfortably, keeping someone out to be the speaker. So I can't see where those numbers are going to really be made up.
Okay, so it really has been a campaign full of independents in a sense, and the Teal independents have made quite a splash. How do you think they'll go? Do you think that 2 or 3 or 4 might actually end up in the House of Representatives?
No, I don't. I only think one of the Teal independents will end up in the House of Reps. I think the current independents, these are independents that have contested elections before and have been elected, I think they will win their seats. People like Rebecca Sharkey in the South Australian seat of Mayo. She's held that seat now for a couple of terms as an independent. I think she'll get up. People like Bob Catter will get up. People like Helen Haynes in Victoria, she'll get up. Alan Wilkie in Tasmania will get up. These are independents that have contested these seats a number of times and they've got a good local profile. As for a lot of these independents that are coming around this time, these, the Teal independents as they're commonly referred to, I just can't see them really snatching these seats from the Liberal Party. A few anecdotal things I'm starting to hear. Allegra Spender in the Sydney seat of Wentworth. My understanding is that her campaign is starting to falter a bit and that Dave Sharma is making up ground there, the Liberal MP. Same in North Sydney. I'm hearing that Kylie Tink that campaign is starting to falter somewhat and that Trent Zimmerman in that seat of North Sydney will likely to retain it. Same with Jason Valinsky on the Northern Beaches. And even Kooyong, which has probably been the most high profile, with Josh Frydenberg coming under attack. I do think that Josh Frydenberg will hold his seat of Kooyong and Monique Ryan will fall short. I think that if any one of these Teal independents does get up, it more than likely will be Zoe Daniel in the seat of Goldstein. She's up against the Liberal Tim Wilson. My understanding is that support has really fallen away for Tim Wilson and that Zoe Daniel could get up. Look, anything can happen on the night. And, and potentially Josh Frydenberg may lose his seat and Dr. Monique Ryan will get up. But from what I'm hearing internally is that they're more confident that the Liberals that are contesting these seats, yes, yes, they'll take a hit, but they'll manage to hold on.
Okay, so let's look at both the leaders. How would you describe Scott Morrison's campaign?
I think Scott Morrison's had a very good campaign in that it's been a slick campaign compared to Anthony Albanese's campaign, which I think's been at times a bit of a train wreck, to be honest with you. But, in terms of the gaffes that he had in the first week, on a couple of issues, not just on the economic issues that he didn't know the unemployment rate, he didn't know the official interest rate. There was a bit of confusion over border policy as well. There've been a few stumbles that have, I think, hurt Anthony Albanese's campaign. But the thing is, and I think this is where there's a key issue, Sean. In the bubble, the campaign bubble and in the Canberra bubble, we may, overanalyze these gaffes or so-called gaffes. But maybe out in punterland, people might see it as a sense of authenticity. Oh, well, okay, Albo didn't know this, who cares? I hate ScoMo, so I'm still going to vote for Labor. There could be that level of authenticity that comes through, that he's human, he makes mistakes. Whereas on the other side of the scale, the Scott Morrison bus and the Scott Morrison campaign, they are such a well-oiled machine.
Yeah.
They do so well on the campaign trail. They really know how to campaign. The problem is that they're still campaigning with a leader that is unpopular out in the electorate. The Liberal Party is very much working on the whole thesis of better the devil you know, that voters probably won't be able to vote for Albanese because they just don't quite know what he stands for, how he'll manage the economy and how he'll deal with international issues. And while they don't like Scott Morrison, in the end, they believe that he could probably offer more leadership qualities. Whether that's enough to get Scott Morrison over the line on Saturday night, well, that remains to be seen. I don't think it is. I don't think it's enough to get Scott Morrison over the line. And I also think that some of Anthony Albanese's flaws will probably hurt him as well. That's why I keep on thinking that a hung parliament is where it's at. And that's what the polls seem to be saying. But you've got the slick campaign that the Liberal Party's had the whole way through. And, Scott Morrison's done well at the press conferences when he's had, a lot of tough questions thrown at him. He seems to be able to handle those press conferences really well, whereas Anthony Albanese, when he gets really peppered with a lot of questions, he just seems to lose his train of thought, seems to get, nervous, starts fumbling. And I think that that's an issue for him, that if he does become the Prime Minister, it's something that he's going to have to work out pretty fast.
Stay with me, Micah. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Michael Pachi, National Political Editor for Nine Radio. I want to ask about a few specific issues and just your quick takes on them. The rise in the official cash rate, the fact that the Reserve Bank lifted interest rates, people with mortgages suddenly have to start paying more. Does it matter in the campaign?
Oh, look, I think it does matter in the campaign because it's only the second time that official interest rates have risen. The last time was in 2007. And even though interest rates are coming from a low base, they were down 0.1%. The bottom line is that the overall cost of living is rising for a lot of people, and an increase to the interest rate is just another impost. So, while the government has, halved the fuel excise and there's been the $250 handouts to pensioners and that sort of thing, I still think that people do feel it. And the other thing is that the Reserve Bank has also indicated that more interest rate hikes are to come.
Yep.
So I think that does play into it somewhat. I don't know by how much, but I do think it does play into the more broader cost of living issue. That's another impost that people need to find money for.
What about the talk about China, particularly after the Solomon Islands signed a security partnership with China? Do you think that will be in people's minds when they're voting?
Yeah, I don't think it's a top order issue. I think that national security and border security are up there with things that people consider, but I don't think it's a top order issue in this election. I actually think the top order issues in this election are cost of living, health, aged care. I think it has shifted to more social issues that people are worried about. While issues like defence and national security are up there, and they do believe that the coalition handles those sorts of issues better than Labor, I do also think that the Liberal Party has been damaged to a certain extent in the sense that, some people think that the deal with the Solomon Islands, that China was signed with the Solomon Islands, people might say, well, hang on, why hasn't the government done more to work with the Solomon Islands to try and encourage them not to have signed that deal? So I do think that Labor did prosecute that case reasonably well, where they tried to say, well, the government has ignored the Pacific, and that's why this deal has been allowed to happen under its watch. Now, of course, that's not entirely true, but as a line, I do think that Labor prosecuted that line and seeded some doubt in some voters' minds that maybe this deal shouldn't have been done and that maybe the government did take its eye off the ball when it comes to that issue.
Okay, a couple of issues which didn't get as much of a run as maybe I had thought ahead of the campaign. Management of the pandemic, that didn't seem to get a huge run.
No, it didn't. And that's actually a very interesting point. Do you want to know what? In virtually this entire campaign, the word COVID has hardly been mentioned.
Right.
It's only been mentioned a few times in the last few press conferences when there's been a few more deaths from COVID and COVID cases are rising in some states. Both leaders have been asked, and, we had Scott Morrison say on Tuesday at a press conference, I think it was, he said, look, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to see lockdowns, and I don't think there'll be COVID lockdowns happening again. People like Anthony Albanese have been a little bit more reserved on those sorts of things, trying to back in the premiers, given that most of them are Labor premiers. But really, COVID has not featured much this campaign, and management of the pandemic has not featured either. And that's because I think that, generally, obviously, the government, when it's spruiking its economic narrative, it says, well, we've shepherded Australia through a very tough 2 years. Now we're going through the recovery and you can't risk that recovery. But on the whole, the general management of the pandemic hasn't really popped up. The PM always says, yes, sure, I shouldn't have said that the vaccine rollout wasn't a race. But in the end, most Australians are vaccinated. We're the most vaccinated country in the world. We've had the lowest death rates from COVID-19, and our economy generally has, come through it compared to other countries.
The other one is the climate wars. Now, it's sort of been there, but really hasn't been centre stage.
No, it hasn't been. That's been another issue that hasn't been too much centre stage. And that's because, again, from what I understand, the research shows, that's the internal party research shows, I think from both sides, that it's not a top order issue. I think that once Australia signed up to net zero emissions, I think for a lot of people that was enough. That it's something that at least the country's starting to deal with it and, join the rest of the world in signing that agreement. Look, and when you think about it, Labor's not saying too much about it either. They essentially, agree with the fact that the government has signed a net zero emissions deal. They might tweak around the edges with a 2030 target. But on the whole, for Labor, it's also a fraught issue. They're trying to win seats in coal countries, especially in far north Queensland. And, they're trying to hold on to seats in the Hunter in New South Wales. So they know that climate change issues don't really play out well in those seats, which they are trying to snatch, especially in Queensland. And as for the government, they'll say, well, we've done what we said that we were going to do in terms of trying to reach net zero. We've got plans in place to get more, hydrogen and lithium and renewable energy into the market in a sensible way. So that's why I think they both have tried to steer clear of it, saying that they've done enough. And if Labor gets in, there'll probably be just some tweaking around the edges, but not too much. The election campaign's become a bit of a blur, Sean, but if I'm not mistaken, I think it was either just before the election campaign or during or very early in the piece where I think that Labor committed to a new coal mine.
Michael, what does a political junkie like you do on Monday?
Well, it's a very good question. You have stumped me there a bit because Monday will be interesting. Monday will be interesting because firstly, are we going to get a result on Saturday night? So if we do get a result on Saturday night, essentially, Anthony Albanese said if Labor is elected, one of the things that he's going to be doing is try and get himself and Penny Wong sworn in so that they can go to the Quad Leaders Summit in Tokyo the next day on Tuesday. But if it's a hung parliament and there's no clear winner on Saturday night, well, I suppose there's going to be the whole issue of votes are still going to be counted. How long is that going to take? Once the votes are tallied up, negotiations starting with some of these independents, all that sort of thing. So, and then obviously if Scott Morrison wins the election, well, I think once Monday comes around, it'll almost be business as usual. And Scott Morrison is going to want to try as much as possible to make it business as usual, probably get himself and Josh Frydenberg sworn in so he can head off to Tokyo for the Quad Leaders Summit. So I think Monday will be an interesting day, if either side wins or if there's no result.
Michael, enjoy the next 36 hours, but honestly, go to Fiji for a week. Like, maybe not next Monday, but at some point, have a break.
At some point, that will have to be happening.
I hope so. Thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
No problem. Thanks, Sean.
That was Michael Pachi, National Political Editor for 9 Radio. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.